It starts off quiet, just another day in court. A black woman walks in and takes a seat in the back, not saying a word. Two officers spot her. They smirk. To them, she looks like someone they can push around, harass, embarrass. Just another target in a system that lets them get away with it. But this time, they picked the wrong woman. What happens next? It isn't a scuffle. It's a chain reaction, a shift in power, a slow burn that explodes when the truth finally hits, and when it does, nothing will be the same. You think you've seen this story before? You haven't? Stay locked in. And hey, drop a comment. Let us know what time it is, where you are, and where you're tuning in from. We're listening. It was supposed to be just another hearing. Another day inside a dusty old courtroom that smelled of varnish, sweat, and old prejudice. The kind of place where justice didn't always mean right or fair, just legal. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence loud. You could feel it in your bones, like a coming storm. The bailiff called the room to order. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly pale glow on the scuffed hardwood floors. The benches creaked as people leaned in. Everyone was waiting for the fireworks, because this wasn't just any case. No, this one had the whole town talking. Civil rights violations, excessive force, a man in a coma, and one name kept popping up like a bad penny: Sergeant Bradley Kane. And there he was, sauntering into the room like he owned the damn building. He wore that badge like armor, his swagger loud, cocky. His buzz-cut hair was sharp, almost military, and those cold blue eyes scanned the crowd like a wolf in a pen full of sheep. He smirked as he made his way to the witness stand, hands resting on his utility belt like pistols in a western. This was his arena. He'd done this dance 100 times before. No fear, no shame. He thought he was bulletproof. Near the back of the courtroom, a black woman sat quietly, dressed in a simple navy blue pantsuit. She had a calmness about her, not bored, not anxious, just still, eyes sharp, back straight. Her hair was pulled back in short natural curls, and she wore no jewelry except a modest watch on her wrist. Some people glanced at her, unsure of who she was, but they all felt something, a presence. And for reasons they couldn't explain, they couldn't look away. Kane didn't see her, at least not yet. His ego filled the room like smoke. He leaned back in the chair at the witness stand, crossed one leg over the other, and when the attorney asked him about the incident in question, he answered like he always did, with a mixture of smugness and disdain. "I followed protocol," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "You people always want to play the victim, but I did what I had to do." A few murmurs passed through the crowd. The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a foul stench, and that's when he noticed her. His eyes landed on the woman in the back. Something in her posture irked him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. And to a man like Kane, that was dangerous. He sneered. "What's the matter?" he said loudly, breaking from the line of questioning. "Got something to say, lady? Or you just here to glare and nod like you're better than everyone else?" The judge banged the gavel. "Sergeant Kane, you are to address only the counsel and the bench." But Kane wasn't finished. "Oh no," he stood. "I know your type," he said, walking toward her like a wolf circling its prey. "Always thinking you're above the law. Always looking for something to cry about." The bailiff moved to intercept, but the woman raised one calm hand without breaking eye contact. She still hadn't said a word. That silence, that unshaken poise, it set something off in Kane. He was used to power that barked, power that flinched. But this silence was louder than anything he'd ever heard. His face twisted with contempt. "You think you're too good to speak to me?" he hissed. "You people need to learn your place." And then he did the unthinkable. Right there, in front of the judge, the attorneys, and a courtroom full of people, Kane raised his boot and kicked her. A brutal, calculated blow, not out of rage, out of humiliation, dominance. He meant to put her on the ground, to make her small. The sound of the impact echoed like a gunshot. The courtroom gasped. Papers flew. A woman shrieked. The judge slammed the gavel over and over, shouting for order. But through it all, she didn't fall. She stumbled sure, but caught herself. Slowly, she stood upright, straightened her shoulders, her eyes locked with Kane's. There was no fear in her face, only fire. And for the first time something shifted in Kane. A flicker of uncertainty, a tremor of doubt. He took a half step back, suddenly aware of how quiet the room had become. The woman finally spoke. 2 words. "Are you finished?" It was like ice water down his spine. He started to reply, but the heavy courtroom doors swung open with a slam. A row of uniformed officers entered, eyes forward, movements sharp. And leading them was a tall, square-jawed man with a gold badge clipped to his lapel. "Sergeant Kane," the man said, voice like thunder. "Stand. Down." Kane chuckled nervously. "Relax. I was just. Now." There was steel in that command. The kind that didn't come from rank. It came from authority, earned. The commanding officer took a few steps forward, then turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing, "allow me to introduce you to the newly appointed Chief of Police for Birmingham, Chief Cassandra Bell." The room froze. Kane's smirk vanished like smoke. His eyes widened, his mouth parted, but no words came out. The woman who had just been assaulted in front of dozens of witnesses was his boss. His new police chief. Cassandra took one slow step forward, never looking away from him. And in that moment, Sergeant Bradley Kane felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Fear. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. No one moved. No one breathed. All eyes were locked on the woman, standing tall after being kicked, Chief Cassandra Bell, and the man who did it, Sergeant Bradley Kane, who suddenly looked like a child caught with a lit match and a can of gasoline. He blinked, searching the room, like maybe someone would tell him this was a joke, a prank, a setup, that this wasn't happening. But it was. Oh, it was very real. Chief Bell didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. That calm expression, that unflinching gaze that was more powerful than any explosion. It said, "I've seen worse men than you try to break me." And they failed, too. The judge tried to restore order, but the court was already unraveling. Cameras snapped. Reporters whispered into their phones. One man in the gallery muttered, "He's done." Another said, "About damn time." Kane, still standing there, looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. You could see it happening in real time, the shift. That cocky posture started to crumble. That sneer started to fade. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something clever, maybe something to reclaim the moment. But all he could do was stare. And Cassandra? She just turned slow, controlled, and walked past him like he didn't even exist. The officers who had entered earlier flanked her. Some nodded with quiet respect. Others looked like they didn't know where to put their eyes. But one thing was clear, everything had changed. Kane finally moved, stiffly stepping back toward the witness stand like nothing had happened. Like the last 2 minutes hadn't just nuked his entire world. But his face was flushed now. That air of control? Gone. The judge called for a recess, but even that couldn't wipe away what everyone had seen. As the crowd slowly filed out, whispers erupted like wildfire. Did you know she was the new chief? No idea. But did you see how he kicked her? That was on purpose. They better lock him up. He's done. The press was already gathering outside. Phones were rolling. News vans moved in like sharks in bloodied water. Back in the hallway, Cassandra stood with her arms folded, flanked by the internal affairs officers. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't need to. Her silence was the headline. And down the corridor, Kane walked with his partner, Officer Tyler Monroe, shoulders stiff, hands clenched. Tyler didn't say a word. He just kept glancing sideways at his mentor, the man he had once looked up to, and now wasn't so sure. Kane caught the look. "What?" he snapped. Tyler shook his head. "I didn't know she was the chief." Kane scoffed. "Neither did I. Damn woman blindsided me. She was just sitting there, and you kicked her." Kane stopped mid-step, and turned on him. "Don't go soft on me now, rookie. You saw her, sitting there all smug, waiting to pounce. She was baiting me." Tyler blinked. "She didn't say a word, man. She just sat there." Kane's jaw tightened. "You don't know how this game works yet. They push. They prod. Then when you push back, suddenly you're the bad guy." Tyler didn't respond. He just kept walking. But in his chest, something churned. He'd been on the force for 2 years. He'd heard the whispers, seen the quiet cover-ups. But this was different. This was public. This was violent. And the person on the receiving end was the highest-ranking officer in the city. In the chief's temporary office inside City Hall, Cassandra Bell sat with her senior liaison, calmly reviewing files. The officer who introduced her earlier, Deputy Chief Nelson, leaned against the doorway. "You handled that well," he said softly. She didn't look up. "I didn't come here for drama. I came here to clean house." He nodded. "You know what Kane's record looks like, right? Over 20 complaints. All buried. I know. That's why I'm here." Nelson stepped in and closed the door behind him. "They're going to fight you," he said. "Hard. Kane's got friends. Not just in this department, but city council, the union, even the mayor's office." Cassandra finally looked up. "Then they can go down with him." Meanwhile, across town, the press was in a frenzy. Local stations broke the story within the hour. Police sergeant assaults incoming police chief in open court. Social media erupted. Civil rights activists, community leaders, and everyday people flooded comment sections demanding answers. But at the precinct, dead silence. Cops who used to walk around like kings suddenly watched their backs. The break room was filled with whispers. The air was different, electric, heavy. And Kane? He sat alone in his office, staring at the wall. His desk, usually stacked with paperwork and complaints to bury, sat untouched. His hands trembled, because deep down he knew this wasn't going away. Not this time. He had spent years walking the line, crossing it, erasing it, redrawing it wherever he pleased. And the system had always let him. The badge had always protected him. But now? The badge was no longer a shield, it was a target. When the sun rose over Birmingham the next morning, the city felt different. It wasn't just another news cycle anymore, it was a reckoning. Every headline carried the same words: police sergeant assaults, black police chief, in courtroom. The footage was grainy but damning. Cameras didn't lie. And what they caught Bradley Kane, in full uniform, kicking an unarmed black woman in a courtroom, was already playing on every screen from gas stations to living rooms. Only now, everyone knew who she was. Cassandra Bell, the new chief of police. And just like that, the man who thought he owned the system found himself standing on shaking ground. Inside the Birmingham Police Department, tension was no longer just something you felt. It had weight. You could see it in the way officers avoided each other's eyes. Hear it in the silence that replaced locker room jokes. Feel it in the slam of a file drawer that echoed a little too loudly. And Kane? He walked through the building like a ghost. No more grins. No more nods. Even his usual circle, the ones who used to ride his coattails, laugh at his jokes, cover his messes, they kept their distance now. Because they knew the system might still be rigged, but this time, it was watching. Upstairs, in a temporary office set up while her new one was still being renovated, Chief Bell stood by the window, looking out over the city like she was mapping every crack in the foundation. She didn't wear her full uniform. Not yet. Just a black blazer, white blouse, and slacks, businesslike, but sharp. Her hair was pulled back tight, not a strand out of place. Her eyes steady. She wasn't smiling. She didn't need to. Deputy Chief Nelson entered, a folder tucked under his arm. "Media's outside again," he said. "Half the department's pretending to work. The other half's waiting to see if you're going to burn this place down." Cassandra didn't move. "And you?" "I brought matches," he said. She smirked just barely and turned back to her desk. "What about Kane?" she asked, voice cool as glass. Nelson opened the folder, flipped a few pages. Administrative leave pending investigation, but the union's already circling wagons. They're calling it a misunderstanding under extreme stress. They want it buried. Cassandra leaned forward. It's not getting buried, it's getting excavated. That's when she did it. She signed the first order with her name in bold print at the bottom. Internal review of Sergeant Bradley Kane's service record, use of force complaints, and disciplinary history. The ink was barely dry before the ripples started. Meanwhile, Kane was pacing in his office, sweating bullets. He hadn't even heard from his union rep yet. That silence? That was new. That was dangerous. He slammed a drawer shut and cursed under his breath. "This is bull," he growled. Across the desk sat Tyler Monroe, his young partner. Quiet, watching, trying to pretend he hadn't seen what the whole country had. "She's not letting this go," Tyler said. Kane turned on him like a coiled spring. "She's making a damn show of it. That's what this is. Public spectacle, trying to humiliate me." Tyler didn't flinch. "You humiliated yourself, man." Kane stared at him for a long second. "You picking a side? I'm picking truth," Tyler said. Kane scoffed, stormed past him, and slammed the door behind him. Truth. What a joke. He made his way toward the stairwell, avoiding the main hallway. But even there, he couldn't escape it. Two rookies stopped talking the moment he walked past. A lieutenant turned away like he didn't exist. The silence was louder than any siren. And then it got worse. Outside, a protest had formed, small, but growing. Elders with hand-painted signs, mothers with their kids, veterans. Young activists, live streaming on their phones. A few even had blown up stills from the courtroom footage, taped to cardboard boards. It wasn't a mob. It was a mirror, and Kane hated what he saw in it. Back upstairs, Cassandra met with the department's legal advisor, then with IA, then with the mayor's office. Every step was calculated, controlled, not a move wasted. By noon, she released a public statement. "I will not allow brutality, disrespect, or unchecked ego to define this department. Not under my watch. Not in this city." The response? A tidal wave. Some hailed her as a hero. Others called her a troublemaker. But one thing was certain: everyone was watching now. Back at the station, Kane knew the walls were closing in. He started reaching out to old allies. The ones who used to have his back. The ones who owed him favors. Except, now they weren't answering their phones. One call went straight to voicemail. Another said, "Sorry, I can't talk about this." And one, his most trusted guy, flat out said, "Brad, it's over." It wasn't just fear. It was abandonment. And he wasn't ready for that. He stormed into the break room, where half a dozen officers went quiet the second they saw him. Kane looked around, eyes blazing. "YALLL, enjoying the show?" he spat. "Or you forgot who trained half of you?" No one answered. So he laughed bitterly and walked out. But he knew. He wasn't just being watched. He was being left behind. That night, Cassandra sat in her temporary office long after the sun went down. The building was mostly empty now, quiet. But she wasn't resting. She pulled out an old photo from her bag, a black and white snapshot. Her father, standing in front of a burning cross, bloody but unbroken. She whispered to herself, "We survived worse." And then she picked up the next file. Because this wasn't just about Kane anymore. This was about cleansing the roots, not just trimming the branches. She was going to tear out the rot, brick by brick. And if that meant going to war with the very system she now led, so be it. Before she was Chief Cassandra Bell. Before the badge. Before the courtroom. Before the stare that could silence a room. She was just a little black girl growing up on the red clay streets of Birmingham, Alabama. Born in 1965, just 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday. Born into a city where the scars from fire hoses and police dogs still bled in the sidewalks. Her mother named her Cassandra because it meant one who sees what others ignore. And she did. She saw everything. She saw her father, Reverend Elijah Bell, walk out the front door every Sunday morning in his pressed gray suit and his worn leather Bible, knowing full well he might come home with bruises or not at all. He marched, he preached, he protected, but he never ran. When she was 7, she stood on her front porch and watched her father get shoved to the ground by a white officer outside a church meeting. His glasses flew, his head hit the pavement, and still he stood back up. Blood dripping down his temple, he looked at the officer and said, "You can knock me down, but I won't stay there. And neither will my daughter." That moment never left her. It burned itself into her bones. Years later, she still remembered the way the officer sneered, the way people just watched. No one stepped in. No one stopped it. They were too scared, too beaten down, too tired of hoping. But Cassandra wasn't tired. She was just getting started. By the time she was 17, she was reading legal codes for fun, not because she loved the law, but because she didn't trust it. She wanted to know its cracks, its loopholes, its blind spots. She wanted to understand how a system built to cage people who looked like her could be turned into a weapon for truth. Her high school guidance counselor told her she was too intense for law enforcement. She thanked him for the compliment. By 23, she had graduated from Howard University with honors and a jaw full of grit. By 25, she was recruited into the FBI back when that was almost unthinkable for a young black woman from Birmingham. But she didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She walked through Quantico like she belonged there because she did. She spent the next 2 decades dismantling human trafficking rings, infiltrating dirty task forces, and investigating the kind of crimes nobody wanted to talk about, especially when the perpetrators wore a badge. She earned every ounce of respect the hard way, through discipline, silence, strategy, and restraint. But deep down, there was still that little girl on the porch, watching her father bleed. That's what brought her back. When she got the call from the mayor's office offering her the position of chief of police for Birmingham, she didn't say yes right away. She spent 3 days walking the neighborhood she grew up in. The church was still there, smaller now, weathered, but still standing. The diner where her father once led boycotts had been turned into a chain restaurant, but the old protest signs still hung in the back room, like ghosts that refused to leave. She visited the cemetery too, stood at her father's grave in silence for over an hour, no words, just wind and memory. Then finally she whispered, "I'm not coming back to fit in. I'm coming back to tear it down." And she did. The department she inherited was a relic, old guard, all white brass. A culture of silence so thick it felt like fog. Officers joked about citizens like they were animals. Body cams accidentally malfunctioned. Complaints vanished into thin air. Promotions went to the loudest, not the best. But Cassandra didn't yell. She reorganized, rebuilt, reviewed over 300 personnel files in her first 2 months. When she made her first command staff change, 5 officers quit on the spot. She didn't even flinch, because she knew reform doesn't come from permission. It comes from pressure. And that pressure was personal, because every time someone told her she was being too harsh, too cold, too rigid, she remembered her father lying on the sidewalk. Every time a union rep threatened to go public, she remembered the sound of her mother crying in the kitchen after another family was driven out of town. And every time she was asked why she was pushing so hard, she smiled and said, "Because it's been broken for too damn long." That's why when Sergeant Bradley Kane kicked her in that courtroom, she didn't fall, because she'd been knocked down before, by hate, by history, by every barrier a woman like her wasn't supposed to cross. And every time she stood back up, people thought the courtroom was the beginning of the fight. They were wrong. It was just the moment the world finally saw what Cassandra Bell had been fighting her entire life. And now she had power, real power. Not just the title, not just the badge, but the people, the story, the truth. And you better believe she was going to use every ounce of it. Because when injustice throws its weight at you, when it hits you with boots, silence, and smirks, what do? You stand, just like her father did. And then you rise higher. The sun barely cleared the skyline when Cassandra Bell stepped through the glass doors of Birmingham Police Headquarters for the first time as chief. She didn't need a ceremony. She didn't want a speech. She just wanted a seat at the table she'd been locked out of her entire life. But that morning, she wasn't just at the table. She was running it. Her heels clicked against the tile like gunshots. Sharp, measured, intentional. Every step said, "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to be heard." The lobby was silent. All eyes turned. Some whispered. Others froze. One officer stood from behind the desk, awkwardly straightening his uniform. "Chief Bell," he said, almost choking on the words. Cassandra gave him a nod. Not warm, not cold. Just enough to say, "I see you. Keep it moving." She didn't smile. She didn't pause. Because she could feel it already, the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions, the walls leaning in like they were listening. She took the elevator up to the executive floor, alone. No aides, no entourage, just her and the sound of her breath, steady and calm. She'd walked into buildings like this her whole career, FBI field offices, federal courtrooms, back rooms where decisions were made in whispers and behind closed doors. But this time, it was different. Because this time, the building had her name on the door. When the elevator opened, the command staff was already waiting. 12 men, 11 of them white, all of them staring at her, like they'd just seen the ghost of accountability walk in. Deputy Chief Nelson stood to the side, arms crossed, watching everything unfold like a man who already knew what was coming. The eldest among them, Captain Darrell Langley, stepped forward, offering a handshake. "Chief," he said, voice dipped in syrup, too smooth to be sincere, "we've been looking forward to your leadership." Cassandra took his hand. Firm grip. 1 second. 2. Then released. She looked him in the eye. "Good. Then you won't mind change." He blinked. The others shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. She didn't wait for them to. She walked past them, straight into the chief's office. The door was already open. Sunlight poured in through wide windows. The desk gleamed like it hadn't been used in weeks. It smelled like dust and old authority. She stood behind the desk, but didn't sit. Instead, she turned back toward the room full of command staff and said, "You can come in now." They filed in slowly, hesitant, like students called to the principal's office. She let the silence hang for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "Let's not pretend what happened yesterday was isolated," she said. "Sergeant Kane didn't act in a vacuum. He's a product of this department's culture, one that has tolerated abuse, ignored complaints, and silenced victims. No one interrupted. No one dared. I've read every disciplinary report from the past 15 years, she continued. You buried enough bodies in paperwork to fill a cemetery. But that ends now. Langley cleared his throat. With respect, Chief Bell, there are due processes in place. She cut him off. I am the process now. The temperature in the room dropped. She let it settle. Then added, you're not here to protect reputations. You're here to protect this city. If that's a problem, you're free to submit your resignation before noon. Silence. Again. Not a shuffle. Not a breath. Just 12 men staring at a woman who refused to shrink. Cassandra finally moved to the chair behind the desk. She sat slowly, deliberately, and folded her hands. This department is not yours anymore. It's the people's. And I'm here to make sure they finally get what they've been denied for too long, justice. Outside, word had already spread that the new chief was in the building. The hallways buzzed with tension. You could feel the shift like pressure in the air before a tornado touches down. Downstairs in the squad room, officers were glued to their phones, watching clips of the courtroom moment on loop, scrolling through live commentary, reading hashtags with Cassandra Bell's name at the center of it all. Some were outraged. Some were scared. Some quietly were hopeful. But none were neutral. In the locker room, Kane stood alone at his open locker. The contents were sparse: his nameplate, a photo of him shaking hands with a former chief, and a folded flag he'd received at a fallen officer's funeral. His hands trembled as he tried to tie his duty belt. He could feel it, the stairs, the distance, the fall. He'd walked these halls like a king for over 20 years, thought he was untouchable, that no matter how far he pushed, the system would always catch him before he hit the ground. But today, no one was there to catch him. Tyler Monroe walked in, pausing at the door. He watched Kane struggle with the buckle, watched the tension build in his shoulders. He didn't say a word. Kane finally looked up. "You got something to say?" Tyler hesitated, then said, "You should probably talk to IA. They're pulling your files." Kane scoffed. "They've pulled them before." "Not like this," Tyler replied. Then he turned and walked out. No salute, no respect, just distance. Cassandra stood in her new office, alone once again, staring out over the city she came back to save. She knew this building wasn't hers yet. Not really. Trust would take time. Fear would take longer to shake. The rot wouldn't leave quietly. But she wasn't afraid of the noise. She was afraid of the silence. Because silence had let men like Kane grow roots. And she was here to pull them out. Every last one. The knock on her door wasn't timid. It was loud, entitled, like someone still clinging to a world that no longer existed. Cassandra Bell didn't look up right away. She knew who it was before the second knock came. She took her time, let the pause sit like smoke in the air. Then, calmly, she said, "Come in." The door swung open with more force than necessary, and there he was, Sergeant Bradley Kane, chest puffed, jaw clenched, eyes full of that same venom he'd carried into that courtroom. Except now, there was something else in those eyes too, something he couldn't hide. Fear. He stepped in without waiting to be invited, which was his first mistake. His second was assuming the room still belonged to him. It didn't. Not anymore. Cassandra didn't offer him a seat. She didn't rise from her chair. She just watched him the way a chess master watches an opponent, flailing 3 moves from checkmate. He stood there, posture tight, like a spring wound too far. "This is how you're gonna play it?" Kane said, voice sharp. "Go public. Drag me through the mud. I thought you were better than that." Cassandra raised an eyebrow. "You thought I was going to protect you?" He didn't answer. She leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on him like a scalpel on bone. "You walked into a courtroom and assaulted your superior officer in front of a judge, a jury, a gallery, and a dozen cameras. And now you think I'm the problem?" Kane shifted on his feet. "I didn't know who you were." "That's obvious," she said. "But what's more important is, why did you think you could do that to anyone and walk away without consequences?" His face twitched. "It was a mistake. You were provoking me." Cassandra's voice was calm. Flat, cold, I didn't say a word. Kane stepped closer. Lowering his voice like that made it more convincing. "Come on, Chief. You don't know what it's like, the pressure out there. People looking at you like they want to kill you. Everyone filming, everyone judging. You don't know. I know exactly what it's like," she said, voice sharp enough to slice. "You think I haven't had guns pulled on me? You think I haven't been called names you wouldn't repeat in a church? You think I haven't walked into rooms full of men who thought they owned me with their stares?" Her eyes narrowed. "The difference is, I never abused that power. You did." Kane didn't speak. Cassandra stood now, slowly, deliberately. She walked around the desk and stood just inches from him. And suddenly he looked smaller, not physically but in presence, in stature, in power. She said, "You've spent your entire career walking that thin blue line, thinking it gave you the right to push people off the edge. You silenced complaints. You buried reports. You weaponized the badge. And now, for the first time in your life, you're being held accountable. That's not injustice, Sergeant. That's math finally catching up." Kane clenched his fists. "You don't scare me." "I'm not here to scare you," she replied. "I'm here to replace you. The The silence between them could have shattered glass. Then Cassandra stepped back, walked to her desk, and pulled a folder from the stack. She opened it slowly, like unsealing a coffin. 15 formal complaints in the last 10 years, she read aloud. Use of force, racial slurs, excessive aggression, and not a single one led to disciplinary action. She looked up. How do you explain that? He didn't even try, because he couldn't. She closed the folder and set it down gently. The Internal Affairs Division is reopening every case, every file, every footnote you thought no one would look at again. Kane's jaw tensed. You're trying to end me. Cassandra walked around the desk again, slowly. No, she said. You did that to yourself. I'm just turning the lights on. He took a shaky breath, tried to gather whatever pride he had left. I've got people in this department who still respect me. She gave him a long, cold look. For now. Then she walked to the door and opened it. Kane stood frozen. This conversation is over, she said. He didn't move. So she added, unless you'd like me to call security to escort you out. That stung. But Kane knew better than to push it. Not here. Not with her. He turned, jaw clenched, eyes burning, and walked out. The door shut behind him, with a click that sounded like a verdict. Cassandra stood still for a long moment. Then she walked back to her desk and sat down. Her phone buzzed. Deputy Chief Nelson. She picked it up. He came. He left. You good? I'm better than good, she said. He's scared. Nelson hesitated. And what about the rest of them? They're watching, Cassandra said. They're waiting to see if I mean it. He asked, do you? She looked out the window, watching the city breathe beneath her. Horns honking. Kids heading to school. Reporters camped outside the building like it was a crime scene. She said, I didn't come back to make friends. I came back to make change. And then she hung up. Outside in the hallway, Kane walked past his fellow officers. Some stared, some turned away, some whispered. But no one stopped him, and no one stood with him. He knew what that meant. The building was shifting, and the floor beneath his feet was beginning to crack. Some men don't go down quietly. Some men can't, because the silence reminds them of what they've lost. For Sergeant Bradley Kane, silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was humiliating. And humiliation was something he had spent his entire career avoiding, burying, and, when necessary, silencing at the source. So when he left Chief Cassandra Bell's office, he didn't head home like he was supposed to. He didn't take the suspension paperwork she handed him, didn't clean out his locker, didn't show any signs of surrender. Instead, he headed to the one place he still believed he had control, the back room of Mulligan's pub, 3 blocks from the precinct. The kind of place where badges drink free and truth never makes it past the front door. The lights were dim, the air was heavy with smoke and old secrets. And seated around a scarred wooden table were 3 men who'd made their careers riding Kane's coattails and covering his tracks. Captain Langley was the oldest, with a comb over that fooled no one and a pension he wasn't ready to risk. Lieutenant Doug Peters' big frame, small mind used to run the vice unit before it disappeared under Cassandra's first round of internal reviews. And Detective Rick Banner, always leaning back like the world owed him something. Kane didn't order a drink. He just sat and said 4 words, "She's coming for us." That was all it took. The room got quiet in a way that felt familiar, like old wolves sniffing blood in the wind. Langley leaned forward. "She's ambitious. She's not stupid. She's going to make examples out of people." "She's already started," Kane replied. "They're reopening every file. IAs crawling through everything. Stuff we thought was buried." Banner snorted. "Hell, they'd need a backhoe to find mine." Peters didn't laugh. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a napkin. "You think she's got the press on her side?" "She doesn't need the press," Kane said. "She's got the people. Social media. The city's eating it up. To them, I'm already guilty." Langley folded his arms. "Then we remind them what happens when you push the wrong people." Kane's eyes narrowed. "You suggesting what I think you are?" Langley smirked. You were the backbone of this department. You still have friends, officers who know you saved their careers. It's not over, unless you let it be. It wasn't about justice anymore. It never had been. This was survival. And men like Kane? They didn't survive by playing fair. They survived by controlling the narrative, by twisting perception into armor. And before the night was over, they had a plan. The next morning, a leaked memo appeared on an anonymous internal message board. It accused Chief Bell of political favoritism, of pushing out veteran officers in favor of diversity hires, of retaliating against anyone who disagreed with her leadership. No names, no dates, just enough smoke to make people look for fire. And it worked. By noon, a local talk radio host, one of Kane's old contacts, picked up the story. By 5 p.m., the city council had received anonymous emails calling for an independent review of the chief's leadership methods. It was dirty, cheap, calculated, but effective, because Cassandra didn't just have to fight backroom deals anymore. Now she had to fight whispers. Deputy Chief Nelson stormed into her office holding the printout. They're moving fast. She scanned the paper, jaw tight. They're scared, she said. That doesn't mean they're stupid, Nelson replied. They're getting in front of you, controlling the message. Cassandra stood, walked to the window. The city looked calm. It was never calm. I don't need a message, she said. I need proof. Nelson paused. You thinking what I'm thinking? I want everything, she said. Unredacted. Old IA files. Suppressed complaints. Anyone who's been pushed out of this department for speaking up, I want names. Nelson exhaled. You know that's going to open doors we can't close. Cassandra turned to him. Good. Then they'll finally see what's been hiding behind them. Elsewhere in the precinct, Officer Tyler Monroe sat at his desk, watching all of it unfold from the sidelines. He saw the smirks between Kane loyalists, the shift in energy, the way eyes darted when Cassandra walked the halls. They weren't attacking her head-on. They were isolating her, discrediting her, piece by piece, and it ate at him, because deep down, he knew the truth. He'd seen Kane's worst behind closed doors. He'd laughed along when he shouldn't have, turned the other cheek when things crossed the line. But now he couldn't unsee it. He opened his computer and accessed an old report. A name popped up, Malik Dorsey, a teenager roughed up in a parking lot 5 years ago. Witness statements had vanished. Body cam footage lost. Kane's name was on the arrest log. Tyler clicked through. Something didn't feel right. And suddenly he wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was part of it. The question was, which part? And which side? Upstairs, Cassandra received a message on her phone. No name, just a number. A former officer who left the department in 2018. The message said, if you're serious about cleaning house, I have something you need to see. She looked at it for a long moment, then typed back 2 words. Send it, because if Kane wanted a war, she was already marching, and she wasn't coming alone. At first, it was just a few voices, a couple of posters taped to the courthouse steps, a hashtag, Stand with Chief Bell. Most people thought it would fade by morning another social spark, swallowed by the daily fire hose of outrage. But by sunrise, the spark had turned into something else entirely. The front of Birmingham Police Headquarters was no longer quiet. It was alive. Dozens of people stood outside the steps, some with bullhorns, some with cardboard signs, and some with nothing but truth written across their faces. Elders who remembered Bull Connor and fire hoses, grandmothers in church hats, teenagers with iPhones filming everything, community leaders, former officers, mothers holding framed photos of sons the system forgot. They didn't come for attention. They came for justice, and they came for her. Chief Cassandra Bell watched from her office window. She didn't smile, but she did nod once to herself. Because when you fight a system this old, this rotten, you can't do it alone. You need people who have nothing left to lose. And they were here now. By mid-morning, the crowd had doubled. A local pastor from 23rd Street Baptist took the mic and preached like it was Sunday service. They say our chief is too bold, I say she's right on time." Cheers erupted. Horns honked in passing cars. And the message was clear. The community wasn't just watching, they were choosing sides. Inside the department, the reaction was immediate. Kane loyalists tensed. They'd expected resistance from within, not from outside, not from them. Langley sat in his office, watching the live stream on his tablet, face tight. "She's turning them into her army," he muttered. Peters agreed. "We let this grow, we're done." But Kane? Kane said nothing. He just stared at the screen, jaw grinding. Because deep down he understood something the others didn't. The game was changing. And Cassandra wasn't just winning, she was flipping the board. Upstairs, Cassandra met with Deputy Chief Nelson and ADA Nina Herrera. The memo smear campaign was still circling through inboxes and low-tier news blogs, but it wasn't sticking, not like they thought it would, because the truth was louder now, and truth doesn't need press releases. "What's the plan?" Nina asked. "They'll try to spin this. Say you're using public emotion to distract from poor leadership." Cassandra didn't flinch. "Let them talk," Nelson added. "The question is, can we back it up?" Cassandra opened a folder and slid it across the table. Inside, witness affidavits, complaint logs, and one damning statement from a former officer who had been forced out after reporting misconduct in Kane's unit. It wasn't enough to bury him yet, but it was enough to make people look. She said, "If they want to test the public's patience, let them. I'm not the one they need to be afraid of anymore." That afternoon, Cassandra made her first public appearance since the courtroom assault. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't bring security. She walked out the front doors of HQ and into the crowd like a general returning to her people. The applause started slow. Then it erupted. A wall of sound, a surge of relief, the kind of moment you feel in your chest, in your bones, in your history. She didn't give a speech. Not at first. She just stood there, present, real. Then someone handed her a megaphone, and Cassandra spoke. "I didn't come here to be a symbol. I came here to serve." The crowd grew quiet. "You've been told your whole lives that your voices don't matter, that your pain isn't real, that if you keep your head down, maybe the system will leave you alone." She looked out at the faces, at the eyes that had seen too much. "Well, I'm not here to leave you alone. I'm here to change what we've been too scared to touch." Applause. Cheers. A man in the front row shouted, "We got your back, Chief." She nodded once and said, "Then let's hold them accountable together." Behind her, a few officers inside the building watched through the blinds. Some sneered, some whispered, but one of them, Tyler Monroe, watched with something else in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. He remembered why he joined in the first place. Not to write reports, not to cover up for guys like Kane, but to protect, to serve. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe that was still possible. Later that evening, Monroe sat at his desk, staring at Malik Dorsey's case file again. There was no video, no audio, but there was a handwritten note at the bottom of one page, half-faded. Witness recanted, refused to sign. He looked up the name, Jasmine R. Collier. Then he ran a search. Nothing, no statement, no official record. It was like she never existed. And just like that, Monroe realized this wasn't just about Kane. It was about a whole chain of people, victims, witnesses, officers erased. He picked up his phone and called the number Cassandra had left him. A direct line. She answered on the second ring. "Monroe," she said. "I think I found something," he said quietly. "Something big." And Cassandra, without hesitation, replied, "Then come see me. Now," because the streets were speaking. The records were bleeding. And somewhere in the shadows of this city, truth was clawing its way to the surface. The file sat between them like a live wire. Cassandra Bell didn't touch it, didn't glance at the paper or the badge number scribbled across the top. She was watching Tyler Monroe instead, young, unseasoned. But something had shifted in him. His shoulders weren't as square as they were last week. His voice wasn't as steady. But his eyes had finally started seeing what had always been there. "You're sure?" she asked. Tyler nodded. "The witness listed in the Dorsey case?" "Jasmine Collier. There's no trace of her statement, just a line that says she recanted. But there's no signature, no follow-up. Just gone." Cassandra leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "How old were you when that case happened?" she asked. 20. I wasn't even in the academy yet." "And Kane?" "Lead on the arrest. Filed the report. Claimed Malik resisted. Said the kid was holding a knife." "And was he?" Tyler hesitated, then shook his head. "I've seen Kane's reports before. He has a pattern, same words, same phrases. He builds a wall of paperwork to justify everything, even when there's no proof, especially when there's no proof." Cassandra nodded slowly. She already knew all this, but she needed to hear him say it. Because in this war, the only way to break the code of silence was from the inside. Tyler cleared his throat. "I don't know where she is now, Jasmine, but if we find her, and if she's willing to talk..." Cassandra didn't let him finish. "If she talks, we might finally have leverage to crack this whole thing open." Tyler sat back in the chair across from her, looking tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. It was the kind of tired you carry when the blindfold starts slipping off, and you see everything that's been rotting right under your feet. "I used to think Kane was just old school," he said quietly. "Hard edge, tough calls. But now..." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't have to. Cassandra stood and walked over to the large corkboard on the far wall of her office. Clipped to it were photos, dates, red string connecting names and badge numbers. Like a map of a battlefield most people refused to admit existed. She pointed at one photo, an older man with sad eyes and a stitched-up forehead. "Leon Fisher," she said, 63, arrested for disorderly conduct while sweeping the front of his barber shop. Broke his hip when Kane slammed him to the ground. Settled out of court. No charges filed." She pointed at another, this time a teenage girl, eyes wide with terror. Danielle Ricks, 16, handcuffed at a traffic stop. "Dash cam lost in upload," said Kane told her to learn her place. She looked back at Tyler. "You're not the first to wake up." He lowered his head. "I should have said something sooner." Cassandra's voice stayed level. "Then say it now. Say it with action." Tyler nodded. "Because it was too late to walk away and too early to turn back." That night, Tyler took a risk. He didn't go home. Instead, he pulled up old digital records, archived complaints, dismissed reports, cases flagged inconclusive or non-disciplinary. And every fifth or sixth one, Kane's name showed up like a watermark no one wanted to see. The patterns were everywhere. Same language, same tone, same strategy, and the same disappearing witnesses. It was a web, and Kane wasn't just caught in it, he had spun it. Tyler drove to the address listed on Jasmine Collier's last known record, a tiny apartment complex in North Birmingham that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since the early 2000s. He knocked on the door. No answer. Knocked again. Finally, a neighbor peeked out from across the hall. "Jasmine moved out a few years back," she said, "after her brother died." Tyler turned. "Her brother?" "Yeah, Dorsey. The boy that got beat up outside the grocery store. You remember?" His blood froze. "You knew him?" The woman nodded slowly. "Malik used to mow my lawn for $5. Polite kid. Quiet. He walked different after that arrest. Didn't talk much. Then, one day, gone." Tyler scribbled notes, thanked her, walked back to his car in silence. So this was real. The names weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were people. And Kane's damage wasn't just departmental. It was personal. He called Cassandra as he sat behind the wheel. "She's gone, Jasmine." "No idea where." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "We'll find her." The next morning, word started spreading inside the department that Monroe was asking questions, that he'd been seen in the archives, that he was talking to Bell. The locker room was cold when he walked in. A few officers nodded. Others turned their backs. One of Kane's crew, Officer Doug Kent, brushed past him and muttered, "Careful, rookie!" Don't get righteous too fast. It'll get you killed. Tyler stared him down, didn't blink. Better to die clean than live dirty. And he walked away, because he had made his choice. And he knew the cost. Upstairs, Cassandra stood over a printer as another internal report printed out this one marked suppressed due to lack of evidence. She didn't need to read the name. She already knew whose signature would be at the bottom, Kane's. And this time, there would be no more burying, no more hiding, because the truth was knocking now, and the walls were starting to shake. The thing about corruption is it doesn't just exist in shadows. Sometimes it wears a robe, sits on a bench, slams a gavel, and calls itself justice. Cassandra Bell had seen enough of the front lines to know that crooked cops weren't the only ones keeping systems broken. Sometimes the rot ran deeper, past the badge, past the booking, all the way to the top of the marble steps, and into the chambers of a man like Judge Leonard Shaw. He'd been on the bench for over 30 years, respected, feared, connected, and untouchable, until now. It was mid-morning when Cassandra walked into the courthouse, not as a witness, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a force. She didn't come alone. Behind her was ADA Nina Herrera and 2 staff attorneys carrying boxes full of files, records, and sealed evidence most people had never laid eyes on. They weren't here for a meeting. They were here to shatter something sacred. Judge Shaw was already seated when Cassandra entered the chamber. He looked over his glasses like a king, annoyed by the presence of a peasant who forgot to bow. "Chief Bell," he said with forced civility, "to what do I owe the honor?" Cassandra didn't smile. "We need to talk." "On record," Shaw gestured lazily. "My docket's full." Nina stepped forward, calm and direct. "Then clear it. This takes precedence." That got his attention. He removed his glasses and leaned forward. "Is that a threat, counselor?" Cassandra placed a thick manila folder on the bench. "No, that's a warning." Shaw opened it. Inside, copies of past rulings, transcripts from dismissed cases, and most damning, a private communication log between his clerk and Internal Affairs from 2014. The cases all had one thing in common: Sergeant Bradley Kane, excessive force, missing footage, dropped charges, rubber-stamped dismissals signed by Judge Leonard Shaw. At least 11 of them. Cassandra's voice was steady, but her words hit like a steel bat to the chest. "You've been the final stop in a long chain of silence. Every time someone tried to come forward, you handed the system a broom." Shaw scoffed. "You're fishing," Nina added. "We've got documentation that your office failed to file formal hearings on multiple civil complaints, and records showing defense attorneys were pressured into withdrawing motions." Shaw stood now. "I've upheld the law in this city for decades." "No," Cassandra replied. "You've upheld a network, a machine. You're not a judge. You're a gatekeeper." The room went silent. You could feel it, that line in the sand. And Shaw knew he couldn't bluff his way out. He narrowed his eyes. "You want me off the Kane case. I want you off the bench." Nina stepped forward again. "We'll be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Oversight Board. By the time this reaches a hearing, you'll be lucky if they let you retire quietly." For a moment, it looked like he might explode. But then, something shifted in his face. A flicker of understanding. The game was no longer his. He sat back down slowly. "This is going to backfire on you, Chief." Cassandra turned to leave. "I've been under fire since I took this badge," she said, "and I'm still standing." Outside the courtroom, word traveled fast. By noon, 3 news outlets had already picked up the story. By nightfall, the footage of Cassandra confronting a sitting judge was viral. And Birmingham? It didn't go quiet. It rumbled. Because the people had seen what justice looked like for too long, and it didn't look like them. That evening, as the courthouse lights dimmed and cameras packed up their gear, a crowd had already formed out front. Not just chanting, not just protesting. They were waiting for Cassandra. She came down the courthouse steps like she'd done it 100 times before. But this time, She stopped at the bottom, looked at them, young, old, angry, hopeful, and said, "We're not here to burn it down. We're here to rebuild it, brick by brick, truth by truth." And the crowd erupted. From the shadows, Kane watched the broadcast on his living room TV, hands clenched, drink untouched. He'd once joked that judges were his insurance policy. Now the policy had expired, and the wolves were at the door. At the precinct, Tyler Monroe worked late. The department was a ghost town after 8 p.m. these days. Ever since Cassandra started pulling records, everyone was suddenly on vacation or out sick. But Tyler? He was in it now. He was following a lead. Old digital dispatch logs from 2015 showed that Kane was on scene during a domestic disturbance involving a black family. And that same night, a complaint was filed by the wife for excessive intimidation. The complaint never reached IA. It was marked handled internally. By who? Judge Shaw. It was all connected. Tyler sat back, staring at the glowing screen, heart pounding. There wasn't a crack in the system anymore. There was a tunnel, and it went deeper than anyone had dared to dig. He grabbed his phone, texted Cassandra one word, confirmed. No punctuation, no need. Because she'd know. The silence was finally breaking, and the reckoning? It had just been sworn in. The past has a smell. Old paper, dust, ink that's faded into ghost trails. And for Cassandra Bell, that smell was all too familiar. It followed her through the narrow hallway beneath the precinct, the kind of hallway most officers never saw, let alone entered. No cameras, no air conditioning, just cold, stale air and a flickering bulb that hummed like it was hiding secrets. She moved slowly, deliberately, her flashlight sweeping over rusted metal cabinets stacked wall to wall. Tyler Monroe followed behind her, clipboard in hand, sweat forming at the base of his neck. "You ever been down here before?" "Once," she said, "years ago, when I was still with Internal Affairs. And?" "They warned me not to come back." They stopped in front of a gray filing cabinet marked closed 2005-2010. Cassandra knelt, gloved hand reaching for the bottom drawer. It didn't slide easily. She had to yank it once, then again. It groaned open like a coffin. Inside hundreds of manila folders, case numbers, initials, thin slivers of forgotten lives reduced to paperwork and red stamps. Tyler flipped through one after another. Noise complaints, petty thefts, juvenile curfews. But then, "Here," he said, pulling a thin folder from the middle of the stack. "This is the one. Case #06-DX34. Cassandra took it. There was no name on the tab, no summary page, just a report inside, typed on a barely legible form. Subject, Jamal Reese. Age, 14. She read aloud, slow and steady. Arrested outside Westwood convenience store. Alleged vandalism. Report filed by Sergeant BKANE. Tyler leaned in. 14? She nodded. No prior record. No guardian present. No follow-up listed. And then she flipped the page. Stopped. A single photograph was clipped to the back. A boy barely a teenager. Swollen lip. A black eye. Staring into the camera like he knew no one would care. But Cassandra cared. And suddenly, so did Tyler. "This never made it to digital records," he said. "This file doesn't exist in the system." Cassandra exhaled slowly. Because someone didn't want it to. There was more. A scribbled note in the margin. Faint, rushed handwriting. Interview cut short. Minor unconscious during intake. Tyler's voice cracked. Unconscious. Cassandra's expression hardened. They beat him before the report was even typed. She looked up. "Get me everything from that week: patrol logs, booking sheets, dispatch tapes, if they exist. I want to know who was on shift, who processed him, and who signed off on his release." Tyler nodded, already pulling out his phone. Cassandra stood still, holding the file in both hands like it might disintegrate. Because this wasn't just another case. This was the root. This was the file that disappeared when no one was watching. And now? Now they were watching. Upstairs, the building was quiet. But news never slept. That morning, a local blog broke a headline. Judge Shaw linked to suppress complaints Bell vows reform. Within hours, it was everywhere. Talk, radio, table, news, Twitter. And under every post, under every photo of Cassandra standing tall on the courthouse steps, one name kept resurfacing in the comments: Jamal Reese. Where is he? What happened to him? Why did this case disappear? And the people of Birmingham weren't just asking, they were demanding. At a diner across town, two older black men folded up a newspaper and leaned across the counter. "You remember that kid?" one asked. "The one from Westwood?" The other nodded. His mom used to work at the hospital. Real quiet woman. What happened to him? Don't know. Just disappeared. And that was the thing. The system didn't always break you loudly. Sometimes it just erased you. Quietly, efficiently, and permanently. Back at the precinct, Kane sat in the locker room, staring at his phone as the notifications rolled in. His name, the headlines, the whispers. He didn't need to read them. He could feel it. The walls were closing in. He opened his locker. Inside, taped to the door, was an old photo of him from the academy standing tall, fresh-faced, shaking hands with the now retired chief. Back when the badge still made him feel invincible, he tore it down without blinking. Across the room, no one spoke to him. The silence was no longer about loyalty. It was about fear. Because when a man like Kane starts to fall, the debris doesn't care who's standing nearby. Cassandra returned to her office just past 9 p.m. The lights were dimmed. She placed the Jamal Reese file on her desk and stared at it for a long while. Then she opened her laptop, typed up a brief, attached scanned copies of every page, and sent it directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Subject line: Request for Federal Review, Pattern and Practice. She leaned back, eyes heavy but alive. Because this wasn't just a report anymore. It was a spark, and she had just lit the fuse. Somewhere out there, Jamal Reese was a grown man now, or maybe he wasn't. Maybe the system had swallowed him whole. But either way, tonight, Cassandra Bell had given him something back. A name, a file, a voice. And tomorrow, she would speak it loud enough for the whole damn city to hear. The precinct was quiet that morning, too quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something no one could predict but everyone could feel. Cassandra Bell sat at her desk, eyes heavy, heart heavier. The file on Jamal Reese still lay open in front of her. That same black and white photo staring up at her young boy. Swollen face, tired eyes. A face too young to be that familiar with pain. She hadn't slept. Not really. How could she? Some truths don't let you rest. They sit on your chest, pressing, pounding, reminding. And then, a knock. Not like the kind she was used to. It wasn't rushed, wasn't sharp. It was deliberate, like someone who had been walking toward this moment for a long time and was finally ready. She opened the door herself. An older man stood in the hallway, late 60s, maybe 70, dressed in a worn denim jacket, pressed slacks, and an old flat cap held respectfully in his hands. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. Cassandra knew who he was before he even spoke. His eyes were tired, but they were clear. "I'm Thomas Reese," he said. "Jamal was my grandson." Silence stretched between them like a crack in a frozen lake. Cassandra stepped aside. He walked in without looking around, didn't comment on the awards on her shelf, didn't notice the city skyline through her window. His eyes never left that file on her desk. He sat slowly in the chair across from her, set his hat in his lap, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of lined paper. The edges were yellowed, the creases worn from time. "This," he said, "was written the night before they took him in." Cassandra hesitated before taking it, unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was messy, slanted, words scratched out and rewritten, but the pain, it was raw. "Granddad, if anything happens to me, don't be mad at Mama. I didn't do nothing. The cop with the blonde hair keeps driving by my school. I think he's mad because I told the truth. I'm scared. But I know you always said tell the truth anyway. So I did. Even if it hurts." She stopped reading. Thomas looked down at his hat. His voice was quiet. "They said he was resisting, said he had an attitude, said he was tagging the store wall." He looked up at Cassandra now. He was tagging with what? A spiral notebook? His voice cracked. "I raised him after his mama passed. That boy barely raised his voice at the dog, let alone a cop. After it happened, they wouldn't even let me see the medical report. Said it was sealed because he was a minor." He leaned forward. "They buried him. Not in the ground, but in paper." In silence, Cassandra felt the weight of the letter in her hands. She'd carried heavy files before, but this felt different. "Where is he now?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. Jamal moved to Chicago after it happened, changed his name, got a job doing construction, said he didn't want to be remembered here, said this city chewed him up. A pause. 2 years ago, he took his own life. The room went still. No words. Just breath. Just memory. Just grief that had aged into something harder. Cassandra closed the letter gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Thomas nodded once. "I didn't come here for sympathy," he said. "I came because I heard your name on the news, and I thought, maybe you'd understand." She looked at him, and for a moment, she wasn't a chief. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a witness, and a promise. "I do," she said. Thomas stood, reached for his hat. Before he left, he looked at her one last time. "You're doing good," he said, "but don't let them turn you into one of them. The badge is heavy, and the line between justice and power, it's thinner than they ever tell you." Then he walked out, quiet, composed, but leaving something behind that felt like a storm. Cassandra stared at the letter. She didn't scan it, didn't photocopy it. She kept it in her desk drawer, top right where she'd feel it every time she reached for a pen. That afternoon, she held a closed-door meeting with the city's legal team and federal liaison. She didn't ask for permission. She informed them, "I want to open a public inquiry into historical misconduct, specifically surrounding cases tied to Sergeant Bradley Kane and judicial suppression." The city attorney frowned. "That'll expose more than just him." "I know," Cassandra replied. "It could blow back on past chiefs, prosecutors, judges, hell, even sitting council members. I know. And once you start, you can't stop." She didn't blink. Good. Tyler Monroe stopped by her office later that evening. He didn't sit, just stood there with that look he was wearing more often now, like someone who finally saw the full weight of the uniform on his chest. "You all right?" he asked. She handed him the letter. He read it. Didn't say a word for a long time. When he looked up, his voice was low. "Whatever you need, Chief, I'm in." Cassandra gave a small nod. Because the war wasn't coming anymore. It was here. And now it had a name, Jamal Reese, and a witness, Thomas Reese, and soon the whole city. Desperate men are dangerous because they've already lost everything they were afraid of losing. Bradley Kane knew the walls were closing in. He could feel it in the way people stopped looking him in the eye, the way doors didn't open as fast, the way conversations ended the moment he stepped into a room. But he wasn't just afraid. He was enraged because the system that once protected him was starting to turn, and it wasn't just shifting, it was sharpening. So Kane did what men like him always do when the truth starts bleeding through the cracks. He planned something dirty, something loud, something final. It started with a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to a union rep, to someone worse, Eddie Greer, private security consultant, former cop, dishonorably discharged. No badge anymore, but plenty of connections. The kind of guy who didn't ask questions as long as the money cleared, and the target was clear. "She's gonna bury me," Kane said. "I need something. Permanent." "Permanent?" Kane lowered his voice. "She's got a file. From the archives. Something about a kid. I don't know what else she has, but it's enough to bring federal heat. I need her discredited. I don't care how." Eddie was silent for a beat too long. Then, "You're talking about your chief, Kane." "No, I'm talking about a problem." The line went dead for 3 seconds. Then Eddie's voice came back, flat and cold. "Where do I start?" Meanwhile, Cassandra Bell was preparing to release the biggest internal review Birmingham PD had ever seen. The list was long: officers with sealed records, misplaced evidence logs, tampered witness testimonies. And at the center of it all, Sergeant Bradley Kane. She'd reviewed the files again and again, cross-referencing everything Tyler found, every anonymous tip, every victim statement from years back. She was ready to go public. And Kane knew it. So Eddie did what he was paid to do. He didn't try to hack into systems. That was too clean, too traceable. No. He waited, watched, planted whispers. One of Cassandra's old FBI files, sealed years ago, started circulating anonymously through back channels. It was bogus, manufactured, but just convincing enough to get people talking. The rumor? That Cassandra had covered up a failed sting operation, that an informant had died under her watch, that she buried it to save her rising career. There was no proof, because it never happened. But proof wasn't the point. Perception was. Kane didn't need to win. He just needed her to lose her footing. The first blog post came at 7:12 a.m., a shadowy website with no byline. Just a headline designed to cut deep. Is Chief Bell hiding a federal scandal? By noon, it had been shared 20,000 times. By 3 p.m., local news was asking questions. By 5, reporters were knocking on City Hall's door. Deputy Chief Nelson stormed into Cassandra's office holding a tablet. "You see this garbage?" She was already reading it. "I've dealt with this before," she said. Nelson shook his head. "Yeah, but not here. Not in this city. These people are looking for any excuse to call this whole reform a witch hunt." Cassandra looked up, calm but fierce. "Then we don't give them an excuse. We give them the truth." That evening, she held a press briefing. No prepared statement, no defensive tone. She walked up to the mic and looked the city straight in the eye. "I know some of you have questions about a report making the rounds today. Let me be clear. There was never a cover-up. There was never a federal scandal. What there is a man backed into a corner, trying to claw his way out with lies." She paused. "Let it land. And I won't let him take this department, or this city, down with him." Reporters fired questions. Flashbulbs popped. But Cassandra didn't flinch, because this wasn't about Kane anymore. This was about truth versus survival. And she wasn't the one scrambling to survive. Back at the bar where Kane was watching the broadcast, Eddie sat beside him, drink untouched. "She handled that better than I expected," he muttered. Kane didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the screen, his jaw clenched, his world unraveling. "She won't stop," he whispered. "She can't stop." Eddie glanced at him sideways. "You want me to escalate?" Kane didn't answer, but the silence said everything. Later that night, Cassandra walked to her car alone. She always did. No security, no fear. But this time, something felt off. The street was too quiet, the shadows too still. She reached for her keys just as a dark figure stepped out from behind a pillar. But before a word could be spoken, another voice cut through the silence. "Chief!" Tyler Monroe's car screeched to a stop, headlights flooding the lot. The figure bolted. Cassandra didn't chase. She didn't have to. She looked at Tyler, breath calm. "You followed me?" He nodded, ashamed. "I had a feeling. Something felt wrong." She gave a slow nod, then looked at the space where the man had stood. She wasn't surprised. She was warned. Men like Kane don't fall quietly. They scream all the way down. But Cassandra wasn't scared. She was sharpened, because if Kane wanted a war in the dark, she was more than ready to bring the light. The microphones were already lined up when she stepped out, 12 in total, mounted on a podium facing a wall of cameras and a sea of restless voices. The flags behind her stood motionless. But the people? The people were waiting to move. Cassandra Bell adjusted the collar of her dark blazer, took a breath that didn't shake, and stepped up to the mic, like she was stepping into a courtroom, but this time, The jury was the city itself, and they were watching, waiting, not just for justice, but for truth, the kind that doesn't come from a press release, the kind that hurts. She didn't start with a good afternoon, didn't thank the press for coming, didn't waste time. What she said instead was this: "You've heard the rumors, the lies, the noise. Now it's time for the facts." The silence that followed was razor sharp. Behind her stood Deputy Chief Nelson, ADA Nina Herrera, Officer Tyler Monroe, and two representatives from the Point Use Attorney's office, each of them holding something: folders, flash drives, binders. But Cassandra? She held nothing, because everything she needed was already in her hands. Her voice, her resolve, her name. In the past 8 weeks, my office has conducted an internal investigation into misconduct within the Birmingham Police Department. What began as a review of a single officer's record has uncovered something far more disturbing. She paused. Not for drama, but for control. We found a network, a coordinated pattern of abuse, suppression, and systemic silence stretching across decades. Gasps, phones raised, recordings started. Reporters leaned in. She continued. Over 30 documented use of force complaints were quietly dismissed with the help of internal gatekeepers. Several judges, including now suspended Judge Leonard Shaw, approved the dismissal of criminal charges and blocked civil suits cases that should have seen the inside of a courtroom, but never did. She glanced across the crowd. I have here a list of names, victims who were arrested, beaten, intimidated, and in some cases permanently silenced. Her voice didn't tremble, not when she said, and at the center of it all was Sergeant Bradley Kane. The name dropped like a hammer. Reporters erupted. Hands shot up, but she didn't stop. Kane used his badge not to protect but to dominate. He targeted vulnerable individuals, particularly young black men, and leveraged fear to maintain control. And for years, he got away with it. She looked straight into the camera, until now. Behind her, Nelson handed a file to a federal agent. Nina Herrera passed a hard drive to the media coordinator. They weren't just making statements. They were distributing evidence, receipts, proof. Cassandra went on. There are departments across this country that have turned a blind eye for too long, to racism, to brutality, to abuse. Ours will not be one of them. Not anymore. Then she reached for the final document on the podium. It was thin, 1 page, but it carried the weight of years. This is a formal request to the Department of Justice, she said, to open a federal investigation into Birmingham PD's historical misconduct, abuse of civil rights, and obstruction of justice. The crowd was frozen. One camera zoomed in on her face, her eyes, steady, tired, unbreakable. I didn't take this job to play politics, she said. I took it to break patterns. And then she stepped back. Microphone still hot, reporters shouting questions. But she was done speaking, because her words had already detonated. Inside the station, every officer glued to the live stream fell into silence. Some stared at the floor, some looked at each other, and some quietly began to pack their things, because they knew what was coming. Back at his apartment, Kane watched the whole thing from a worn leather chair, the lights off, his name echoing out of the flat screen in front of him, over and over. Sergeant Bradley Kane, Sergeant Bradley Kane, the center of it all. He didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't breathe for a long stretch. Then he stood, and for the first time since this began, he realized he wasn't fighting Cassandra anymore. He was fighting the truth, and the truth doesn't blink. Later that night, Cassandra walked out of City Hall alone. She didn't need a security detail. She had something better. The people. They were waiting outside, not with protest signs anymore, but with applause, with tears, with respect. And as she stepped through them, one older woman reached out and touched her arm. She said, "We prayed for someone like you for 50 years." Cassandra looked at her and simply said, "I'm here now." Tyler Monroe met her at the curb, opened the passenger door. She climbed in without a word. They pulled away in silence. the crowd parting like waves. Inside the car, Tyler glanced over. "You think they'll try to push back?" "They already have," Cassandra said. "Now they're out of time." He nodded, then asked something he hadn't dared before. "What made you come back? After everything?" Cassandra looked out the window, watched the city blur into light and shadow, and then she answered, quiet and steady. "Because the system thought it had the last word." She turned back to him. "But it forgot I could speak too." It started like any other morning. Coffee brewing, fluorescent lights buzzing, paperwork stacked in trays nobody really read. The precinct was quiet, but not peaceful. More like the air right before a thunderstorm, thick with tension, heavy with something everyone could feel but no one wanted to name. Some officers were already whispering. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to notice that their radios were quieter than usual, their routines just slightly off. But at 8:43 a.m., the silence broke. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and when they did, it wasn't just another shift change. It was a shift in power. Chief Cassandra Bell stepped out first, dressed in full uniform, hat in hand. No blazer, no plainclothes. This was war paint. Behind her came 2 federal agents and 1 internal affairs officer. No one said a word. Not yet. They moved with purpose straight through the heart of the precinct, past cubicles and glass-walled offices, through the briefing room where a few stunned officers froze mid-sentence. And they didn't stop until they reached the locker room. Inside, Bradley Kane was zipping up his vest, humming to himself, still clinging to the illusion that he belonged here. He didn't see them right away. He looked up, halfway through adjusting his belt, and that's when he saw her, Cassandra Bell, standing just inside the doorway. Not angry, not smug, just calm, centered, like someone who had already buried what she needed to bury. Kane blinked, then laughed once, short and sharp. "This some kind of performance?" Cassandra didn't answer. The IA officer stepped forward. "Bradley Kane," he said, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress evidence, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of civil rights violations under federal statute." Kane's smirk cracked. The 2 agents stepped forward. One produced cuffs. "No," Kane said quietly. "You're not doing this. Not here." He looked around. 4 officers stood in the back of the room, men who used to laugh at his jokes, shake his hand, back his every move, but now they didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. And that was the final blow. Kane took a step back, hands raised. "You're really gonna do this in front of everyone?" Cassandra nodded once. "Exactly. Because men like Kane were made in public, so they had to be broken in public too." The cuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound echoed through the room like a church bell, tolling for the end of something old and mean. Kane didn't resist, but his face twisted not with guilt, not with regret, with rage. The kind of rage that comes from watching the world move on without you. He looked Cassandra dead in the eye. "You think this changes anything?" She looked back, just as steady. "I know it does." They walked him out in front of the entire precinct. Officers parted like water. Some turned away. Some didn't. Cameras were already waiting outside. Reporters, community members, families, people who had lived in silence for too long, and when they saw Kane head down, hands behind his back, they didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just watched. Because this moment wasn't for celebration. It was for truth. Back inside, Tyler Monroe stood at his desk, watching through the glass. His breath caught. He'd worn that same badge, taken the same oath, shadowed that same man. But now, he finally understood what it meant to serve. Captain Langley approached him quietly, expression unreadable. "Bet you think you're a hero now," he said. Tyler looked at him. "No," he replied. "I think I'm finally doing the job right." Langley said nothing, just walked away. And maybe for the first time, Tyler didn't care if that door ever opened again. Outside, Kane was loaded into the back of a federal vehicle. Cassandra stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes calm. One reporter shouted, "Chief Bell, What do you say to those who think this is just a publicity stunt? She turned, faced the cameras. I say justice isn't a stunt. It's a reckoning. Another asked, is this the end of the investigation? She replied, no, this is the beginning of accountability. The door shut behind Kane with a final, hollow thud. Cassandra didn't look away, because in that moment, she wasn't just a chief, she was a survivor, a daughter of Birmingham, a product of resistance. And now, the face of its rebirth. Hours later, in a quiet conference room, she met with representatives from the Department of Justice. Formal charges were being filed, depositions scheduled, old cases reopened, and for the first time in decades, the system was being forced to look at itself, ugly, naked, unforgiving. And it had Cassandra Bell to thank for that. That night, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, she stood on the rooftop of HQ, alone. She could still hear the city breathing, sirens in the distance, footsteps on pavement. But beneath it all, something new, a pulse, not of fear, not of outrage, but of hope. The kind you only earn when you stop pretending the past never happened and start making damn sure it never happens again. She looked up at the stars, then down at the badge on her chest, and for the first time since she took the oath, she allowed herself the smallest smile, because the first domino had fallen, and tomorrow, the rest were coming down. The courtroom looked different this time. Same wood-paneled walls, same worn carpet, same heavy silence. But something in the air had shifted. This wasn't the place where Cassandra Bell had been kicked in front of a judge. This wasn't the place where she'd stood in silence, while the weight of every unspoken injustice filled the room like smoke. This was the place where the reckoning began. And now, she had the mic. Bradley Kane sat at the defense table, his hair grayer than before, his face thinner, his posture still proud but hollow, like a statue everyone stopped admiring. He didn't look at her. Not yet. The judge presiding over the case wasn't Shaw. He had been suspended indefinitely. This one was a federal appointment. Judge Alicia Grant. Sharp. Tired of excuses. Known for shutting down theatrics and drilling straight into truth, the prosecution began with opening statements. The list of charges read like an obituary for a career. Civil rights violations, falsifying reports, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress evidence, assault. But underneath every legal term was a story, a name, a face, a family left to wonder if justice was just a word. And when they called their first witness, the room held its breath. Chief Cassandra Bell, please take the stand. She stood slowly, not as a victim, not as a symbol, as a witness. She raised her right hand, swore her oath, and sat in the same chair she had once stood beside, blood in her mouth and silence in her throat. Not today. The prosecutor approached gently. Chief Bell, let's go back to the day you were assaulted in this courtroom. She nodded. It was a hearing involving a use of force complaint. I was present as an observer. Why were you observing? I had been appointed chief of police the week before. I hadn't made a public announcement. I wanted to see the department from the outside before I walked in. The attorney nodded. And did Sergeant Kane know who you were? No, but it shouldn't have mattered. That landed hard. The jury shifted in their seats. And what happened when he noticed you? Cassandra's eyes didn't blink. He approached me, verbally harassed me. Then, without provocation, he kicked me. Gasps didn't come this time. Everyone already knew the story. But hearing it in her voice, that was different. What did you do after that? I stood up. I didn't respond. I waited. Why? Because men like Kane want chaos. They thrive in noise. I gave him silence, and it unraveled him. The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie like it might tighten around the truth. Chief Bell, he said, isn't it true that you have a reputation for being difficult? That you've ruffled feathers, even within your own department? I ruffle feathers when I break patterns, she replied. That tends to make predators nervous. He cleared his throat. You conducted an internal investigation that uncovered misconduct, but some say your methods were aggressive, targeted. I targeted injustice, she said. If some people found that uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why. He tried to shake her, tried to imply she came back to settle scores, to play politics, to build a legacy. But Cassandra wasn't there to be shaken. She wasn't playing a role. She was delivering testimony built from blood, bone, and memory. When the cross-examination ended, the room sat in stunned silence. And Kane? He finally looked at her, not with defiance, with something worse. Recognition. Because this wasn't the Cassandra he thought he could humiliate. This was the Cassandra who stood when everyone else sat down. Over the next 2 days, the prosecution presented their case. Victims testified. Fellow officers confessed. Files once buried were read aloud under oath. Names Kane thought were lost to time returned like ghosts. Jamal Reese, Danielle Ricks, Leon Fisher. One by one they rose. One by one they spoke. And as each voice echoed through that courtroom, the foundation beneath Kane began to crack. Tyler Monroe took the stand too. He didn't hold back. He admitted what he ignored, what he saw, what he regretted. And then he looked straight at Kane and said, "You taught me how to wear the badge, but you never taught me what it meant. That part I learned from her." He pointed at Cassandra, and something inside the room shifted again, like a dam cracking. The defense tried to regain ground. They questioned memories, twisted narratives, claimed inconsistencies. But it was like trying to hold back a river with an index card. Cassandra watched it all from the gallery, hands folded, expression unreadable, because she didn't need to celebrate. She just needed to endure. On the 5th day of the trial, the prosecution rested, and the courtroom, once filled with fire and pressure, felt still, like something was about to end, or begin. Kane's attorneys whispered, negotiated, delayed, but no deal could undo the voices already spoken. The court recessed for the day. As people filed out, a young boy approached Cassandra in the hallway. Couldn't have been older than 11. He wore a tiny hoodie 2 sizes too big and held his mom's hand like a lifeline. He looked up at her and said, "Are you the lady that made the bad guy get arrested?" Cassandra knelt down. "I helped," she said softly, "but a lot of people had to speak up first." The boy nodded, like he understood, then said something she would carry forever. "My brother says you're not scared of anything. I want to be like that too." Cassandra smiled. But it wasn't pride, it was purpose. She stood up, looked around at the families gathered outside the courtroom, and knew the trial wasn't just about Kane. It was about what came next. The system had cracked, but now someone had to rebuild it, and she was ready to lay the first brick. They came in one by one, no headlines, no cameras, just names most of the city had forgotten if they ever knew them at all. But inside that courtroom, their voices carried the weight of years, of silence, of bruises that faded from skin but never from memory. The judge called the next witness. An older man stood up from the back row, spine crooked with time but eyes steady. "Please state your name for the record." "Leon Fisher," he said. "Barber, retired, 63 years old." He walked slow to the stand, leaning slightly on a cane that had become part of his body ever since the day. Kane put him on the ground. He sat, raised his right hand, took the oath, and began. "I wasn't doing anything but sweeping my front steps. Same thing I'd done every morning for 30 years. Had the same broom since 93. He gave a dry chuckle. No one laughed. And then he showed up. He nodded toward Kane. Said I looked suspicious. Said someone had reported loitering. I said I owned the damn shop. I said my name was painted on the window. Next thing I knew, I was face down on the sidewalk, hip shattered in 3 places. He paused, took a breath. They told me to settle. Said I was lucky not to be charged with resisting. I still can't walk right. Still get winded just going to the mailbox. He looked directly at the jury. I served in the army. I cut half the police department's hair over the years. But that didn't matter. Not to him. He pointed. Not to that man. Next witness. A woman, late 30s, hair tied back, hands clenched in her lap like she had to remind herself she was safe now. Danielle Ricks, she said, mother, anti-nurse, survivor. She was 16 when Kane pulled her over on a side street for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. He told me to step out of the car, she said. I asked why. He didn't like that. Her voice didn't shake. I was handcuffed and made to sit on the curb for 40 minutes. Cars driving by, people watching. He called for backup like I was dangerous. She looked at the prosecutor. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, but I never forgot the way he looked at me, like I was nothing. The prosecutor nodded gently. Did you file a complaint? She laughed, once bitter and sharp. I did. A week later, someone from the department called my house and told my father he should teach me respect before something worse happened. Silence swept across the room. The gallery was still. Even the reporters stopped typing. Because this wasn't just testimony. It was confession. Not from the defendants, but from a system that had let this happen over and over again. Next witness. A man in a wheelchair. Late 40s. Thin, hands trembling slightly. Name's Calvin Rowe, he said. Was a music teacher. He swallowed. Until I ran into Kane. He had been pulled over after a school concert. Tired. Still wearing a suit. Said Kane accused him of swerving. Asked if he'd been drinking. I told him no. I told him I had kids in the car earlier that night. That I was a teacher. That I didn't drink. Calvin's hands trembled harder now, but it didn't matter. He made me get out. Told me to get on my knees if I thought I was so innocent. He paused. I had a knee replacement. Told him I couldn't kneel like that. The jury leaned forward, so he pushed me. Hard. I fell wrong. Snapped a vertebra. Calvin's voice broke. That was the last time I stood. Cassandra closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to steady her own breathing, because she remembered that name, that case. And she remembered the report Kane filed. Subject refused lawful commands. Force used in accordance with protocol. That word protocol had become a shield for brutality. Until now. The final witness that day wasn't on the original list. The prosecution motioned to admit new testimony based on recent developments. The judge agreed, and then a name echoed through the room like thunder. Thomas Reese. The crowd shifted. Cassandra sat up straighter. He walked in slowly, still wearing that same denim jacket, still holding that folded letter in his pocket. He took the oath, and then he looked out at the courtroom like a man who had waited decades for a room to finally listen. My grandson's name was Jamal. You probably never heard of him, but you should have. He held up a photograph, a young boy, grinning, missing tooth, brown skin and bright eyes. He was 14 when Kane arrested him, said he was tagging a wall. Jamal was carrying his homework folder, had just come from tutoring. He looked at Kane. He never healed from that night. He stopped talking, stopped laughing, moved away to forget, changed his name. But trauma doesn't respect zip codes. Thomas's voice cracked now. He took his own life 2 years ago. The jury shifted. The judge looked down. No one spoke. Until Thomas continued. He left me a letter. Said he tried to be brave. Said he told the truth. Said the system wouldn't believe him, but maybe one day someone else would. He looked at Cassandra now and nodded. Someone finally did. When court adjourned, the hallway filled with murmurs, reporters scrambling, phones buzzing. But no one was louder than the truth now. It had been whispered, dismissed, buried. But today, it stood up, testified, and refused to be silent ever again. Everyone remembers the moment the jury comes back. It doesn't matter how long the trial is, how many witnesses testify, or how many tears get shed in that courtroom. Because when that little door opens and 12 strangers file back in, every breath in the room stops. And on that day, after 10 days of testimony, after years of silence, after lives shattered and rebuilt in front of a judge, the city of Birmingham held its breath for one name, Bradley Kane. He sat at the defense table, hands folded too neatly in front of him, like posture could still save him. Like control was the one thing he hadn't lost yet. He didn't look shaken. He looked hollow, because sometimes a man doesn't realize the house is on fire until the roof is already gone. The judge re-entered. The bailiff called for silence. And 12 people, their faces lined with hours of deliberation, sat back in their seats, holding the weight of a city on their shoulders. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Judge Alicia Grant asked. The foreperson, a black woman in her early 50s, stood, strong, clear-eyed, like someone who knew what injustice looked like and what it felt like to finally fight back. Yes, Your Honor, we have. The clerk stood. On the count of civil rights violations. How do you find the defendant? The foreperson looked up. Guilty. The word echoed. Kane blinked once. No reaction. Just sat there, stone still. On the count of falsifying police reports. Guilty. Cassandra Bell sat in the gallery. No movement, no smile, just listening. On the count of obstruction of justice. Guilty. Each word struck like a hammer. The kind that doesn't just break chains, it rings out, long after the final blow. On the count of aggravated assault. Guilty. On the count of conspiracy to suppress evidence. Guilty. And finally, on the count of misconduct in public office. Guilty. The room stayed quiet. No applause, no cheers, because this wasn't a celebration. This was a funeral for the man Kane used to be, for the silence that had protected him, and for the system that let him believe it always would. Judge Grant thanked the jury, dismissed them, then turned to Kane. Her words were brief but final. Mr. Kane, you've been convicted on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled within the week. Until then, you will remain in federal custody. Kane didn't speak, didn't blink, but his hands clenched into fists so tight, his knuckles turned white. Because it was real now. Not headlines, not whispers, judgment. Cassandra stood as the courtroom emptied. Outside, the crowd had already gathered. Reporters, community members, victims, survivors. They didn't need a speech. They had the verdict. Tyler Monroe met her at the door. Guilty on all counts, he said softly, like he needed to hear it out loud to believe it. Cassandra nodded. You did good, she said. He looked down. I should have seen it sooner. You see it now, she replied. That's what matters. Across the courthouse lawn, Thomas Reese sat on a bench, hat in his hands, staring at nothing and everything all at once. Cassandra walked over, sat beside him. He didn't speak right away, just handed her something. It was a photo, Jamal, smiling in front of his middle school, backpack slung over one shoulder. He'd be 24 this year, Thomas said. Cassandra looked at the photo like it was a life she almost recognized. I'm sorry he's not here to see it, she whispered. Thomas nodded. He is. They sat in silence. 2 generations of witness. 2 souls that had carried too much for too long. And for once, there was nothing left to explain. Later that night, the city breathed. Not all at once. Not in relief, but in release. For the first time, people walked a little differently, held their heads a little higher. Because when justice finally speaks, in a place where silence once ruled, the ground shifts. And Cassandra Bell? She didn't go to a podium. She didn't face the cameras. She went home, sat in her living room, turned off the lights, and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember her father, her city, that courtroom, that chair. The way Kane looked at her like he could still break her, and the way the system finally said no. And in that stillness, in that quiet, she allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years. Not vengeance, not victory, just peace. Because justice hadn't come fast. It hadn't come clean. But today, it came, and for once, it stayed. The trial was over. The verdict was in. The headlines had started to fade. But for Cassandra Bell, the real work was just beginning. Because justice isn't a finish line, it's the foundation. And if you don't build something better on top of it, then all you've done is dig a deeper hole. So she went back to the precinct, not as a symbol, not as a hero, as a builder, and she brought blueprints with her. Not on paper, but in her bones. She started with the command staff. Of the 12 senior officers she'd met on her first day, 8 were gone. Some retired early. Some were removed quietly, files stacked in manila envelopes, and handed off to legal. Some fought it, but the culture was no longer theirs to protect. Cassandra called her first staff meeting with new faces around the table. Deputy Chief Nelson sat to her right. On her left, Tyler Monroe, promoted to sergeant. It wasn't a favor, it was earned. His file was spotless. But more than that, he'd changed. He'd stepped out of the shadow of the old guard and into the fire without flinching. Across the table, Lisa Tran, Internal Affairs. Latina, tough as nails, straight from Houston PD's Reform Division. Beside her, Marcus Allen, a former community outreach liaison turned captain, grew up in the East Side, knew every name on every block. Cassandra looked at all of them, then laid it out. We're going to be the department people hoped we were. No one interrupted. They just listened. She continued. Starting today, body cams stay on, no exceptions, no technical issues. Any report that's missing footage gets flagged for audit. Someone nodded. Second, we're opening civilian review boards. Real ones. With power to recommend discipline. Not just sit in meetings and take notes. Lisa spoke up. That's going to get pushback from the union. Cassandra met her eyes. Good. Let them push, she went on. We're bringing in community instructors to help design new training protocols. De-escalation, racial bias, mental health response. Someone asked, what about recruitment? She leaned forward. We don't need more bodies. We need better ones. From the neighborhoods we serve. We recruit locally. We pay cadets to train. And we support them beyond the academy. It wasn't just a policy shift. It was a cultural reset. The kind people thought was impossible. But Cassandra never cared much for what people thought was possible. The following weeks were hard. There were resignations, rumors. A few media outlets tried to reignite old flames, calling it a purge and overcorrection. Cassandra didn't answer them. She answered with work. Every Thursday she held office hours not for officers. For citizens. Anyone could walk in. No cameras. No security barriers. Just a woman in uniform behind a desk, ready to listen. They came in slowly at first, then in waves. Mothers, teachers, teens, former inmates. Some just sat and cried. Some brought names. Some brought solutions. And she wrote everyone down. Because trust wasn't earned through statements. It was earned by showing up, by staying. Tyler Monroe, now working directly with the Community Outreach Unit, began rebuilding bridges with groups that hadn't set foot inside the precinct in years. He started with the Reese Foundation, named after Jamal, started by Thomas. They met in a church basement, old folding chairs, water pitchers, mistrust. But Tyler showed up, week after week, no badge, no agenda, just presence. And over time, the walls cracked. One meeting, a young man, maybe 17, stood up and said, I don't trust the police. Tyler replied, I wouldn't either, if I were you. Then he added, but I'm here to earn something back, not just for me, but for who wears this next. That mattered. Because healing isn't loud, it's layered. And Cassandra understood that better than anyone. She also knew she couldn't do it forever. One night, standing on the rooftop again, she told Nelson, I won't be chief forever. He raised an eyebrow. You thinking of leaving already? She shook her head. Not yet. But the system fails when it's built around one person. We need to build something that outlives me. He nodded. Then asked, what do you think it'll take? She looked out over the city, its flickering lights, its uneven skyline, its relentless pulse. Consistency, she said. And courage. Because anyone can light a match. But keeping the flame alive, that takes something deeper. In her office, she hung a new plaque on the wall. It wasn't an award. It wasn't a commendation. It was a handwritten quote, framed behind glass. It said, power without accountability is not justice. It is tyranny. She wrote it herself. It was the exact sentence she spoke in court, and it would hang there as long as she did. Because if anyone forgot why she came, they'd only need to look up. It was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was peace. The kind that comes after a long storm, the kind that doesn't roar anymore, just hums through the walls you rebuilt with your own hands. Cassandra Bell stood in the middle of the precinct lobby, watching the morning shift roll in. Uniforms moved with purpose. Officers greeted each other, not with stiffness, but respect. The air felt lighter, still serious, still sharp, but different. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to, because everything she came here to change had changed, bit by bit, brick by brick. She walked the hallways slowly, like retracing steps you used to run through but never had time to notice. Every wall held a new memory now, every face a reminder of why she stayed. In the new community liaison office, a young officer was helping an elderly woman fill out a neighborhood complaint form. In the squad room, two detectives, one white, one black, were comparing de-escalation notes from last week's mental health training, debating which methods were more effective. Downstairs, Tyler Monroe was holding an onboarding session for a fresh batch of recruits. They were listening, actually listening. Cassandra stopped at the door, leaned in without speaking. One of the recruits raised their hand and asked Tyler, "What do we do if we see another officer step out of line?" Tyler didn't hesitate. "You say something. You stop it. You report it. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter how long they've been wearing a badge. Integrity doesn't punch out at the end of the shift." Cassandra smiled to herself. Because that wasn't the Tyler Monroe she met. That was the Tyler he became. She stepped away before he noticed her. Some goodbyes don't need words. Later that afternoon, she sat alone in her office for the last time. The desk was clean. The drawer that once held Jamal Reese's letter was now empty, but not forgotten. She'd given it to Thomas with a promise. His grandson's name would never vanish again. She looked around the room, at the quote on the wall, at the light coming through the blinds. She remembered her first day here before the uniforms knew who she was, before the courtroom, before Kane. That day, she walked in with only silence on her side. Today, she walked out with a legacy. Deputy Chief Nelson knocked once, then entered. "You sure about this?" he asked. She nodded. "It's time. They're going to try and talk you out of it. They already did. And you didn't listen?" She smiled. "When have I ever?" He sat across from her, serious now. "You know what you did here, right?" "I didn't fix everything," she said. "No, but you broke what needed breaking. And that's how fixing starts." She stood, grabbed her coat. No speeches, no press conferences, no parade, just a quiet walk through a building she helped tear down and rebuild all at once. As she reached the elevator, several officers stood nearby. They didn't crowd her, didn't swarm her. They simply nodded, and she nodded back. Respect, earned, not demanded. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped in. As they closed behind her, she didn't feel loss. She felt weight leaving her shoulders. Years of it, not because the work was over, but because it wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. On the street, the city looked the same. Same skyline, same cracks in the pavement, same air full of sirens and stories. But underneath it all, something had shifted. Not in the government, not in the headlines, in the people. They believed again, not in perfection, but in the possibility of justice. Real justice. The kind that doesn't need a spotlight to exist. Cassandra walked past the courthouse. The one where it all began. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. That building didn't own her anymore. She passed a group of kids walking home from school. One of them looked up and whispered to his friend, "That's her." Cassandra kept walking. Let them talk. Because stories like hers were meant to outlive the storyteller. At home, she sat on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the light dip below the rooftops. She thought of her father, his strength, his voice. his scars. She thought of Jamal and Thomas and all the others who'd sat in silence for too long. And she thought of every officer who would now walk into that department with something different in their chest. A conscience that wouldn't let them look away, a duty that didn't stop at the badge, and a name on the wall that reminded them why. Because Cassandra Bell may have left the building, but she never left the mission, and long after the applause faded, long after the headlines turned to something else, she would remain, not as a chief, not even as a legacy, but as a lesson, a reminder that justice, when it finally comes, doesn't come like a roar. It comes like a woman walking out of a courtroom head high, soul intact, truth on her heels. And it keeps walking forward, always forward. What happened in this story wasn't just about one corrupt officer or one courageous woman. It was about all of us. About what happens when silence goes on too long. About what we choose to stand for when no one else will. Cassandra Bell didn't walk into that precinct looking to be a hero. She walked in because someone had to. Because if not her, then who? She didn't ask for power. She demanded accountability. And when the system pushed back, she stood taller. That's the lesson. You're never too old to fight for what's right. Never too late to speak up. And justice, real justice, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly, firmly, one step at a time. And if you've ever felt unheard, overlooked, underestimated, remember this: the most powerful change often begins with the quietest person finally saying, enough. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or someone else's, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We've got more stories coming true, powerful, human stories made for people who know what it means to fight, to lose, to rise again. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what stood out to you. Because your voice matters here. And like Cassandra proved, sometimes one voice is all it takes to start a revolution.